Ever feel like the world's on a collision course, like we're barreling towards disaster?
Well, you're not alone. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
That's right. We're exploring the work of Noam Chomsky, the world-renowned linguist, philosopher, and political activist.
He might not be the most cheerful guy, but he's certainly thought-provoking. And he's got a lot to say about the existential threats facing humanity.
Based on a lecture he gave back in 2016 and some updates he's made since then, we're going to take a deep dive into his ideas about internationalism and, well, the possibility of extinction.
Heavy stuff, right. But it's essential to understand where we are and where we might be headed.
So Chomsky identifies two major threats to our survival: nuclear war and climate change.
Two of the biggest, scariest things out there.
Yeah, no kidding. And he links these threats to a specific point in history, the end of World War II.
It was a turning point, not just for human history, but for the planet itself. Scientists even call this new era the Anthropocene.
The Anthropocene, huh?
Yeah. It's a new geological epoch, defined by the massive impact humans are having on the Earth.
So, we're talking about a shift on the scale of ice ages and mass extinctions.
Exactly. And get this, the group of scientists who study the Anthropocene, they're actually proposing that it began right around the same time as the nuclear age.
Wow, that's chilling. The forces that could destroy us are also reshaping the very planet we live on.
And the data on CO2 emissions is particularly alarming. It's rising faster now than in the past 66 million years. 66 million years.
We're talking serious geological timescales here.
We've already exceeded 400 parts per million, which is considered a critical danger point. Basically, we're pumping carbon into the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate.
Like a runaway train headed for a cliff. And speaking of labels, some experts even argue that Anthropocene doesn't quite cut it.
They prefer the term capitalistocene.
Capitalistocene? What does that even mean?
Well, it suggests that it's not just humans in general who are driving this change, but a specific economic system, capitalism. It's a more pointed critique of our economic model and its impact on the environment.
A system built on endless growth, regardless of the consequences. It's a pretty provocative way of framing it. But whatever we call it, the consequences are undeniable. And Chomsky argues that we're now in the midst of the sixth mass extinction.
Mass extinction, huh? Sounds pretty dire.
Yeah. We've had 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history, each wiping out a huge percentage of life on the planet.
And this one, Chomsky argues, is unique because it's hitting larger animals particularly hard. Think mammoths, giant sloths, all those incredible creatures that went extinct in the past.
Right. And he connects this to patterns we've seen since early humans emerged. We've always had an impact on our environment, but our modern tools and technologies are amplifying that impact to a terrifying degree.
It's like climate change is the slow-motion asteroid impact, causing droughts, floods, and storms that displace millions of people every year.
And it's not just about the environment, right? The human cost is already staggering. Think of Bangladesh, where rising sea levels could displace tens of millions of people.
It's hard to even fathom that scale of displacement. And Bangladeshi climate scientists are making a powerful argument. They say that people displaced by climate change should have the right to migrate to the countries that are most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions.
It's a huge moral and political question. Who bears responsibility for climate change? And what obligations do we have to those who are most affected?
These are tough questions, and there are no easy answers.
And Chomsky really hones in on the U.S., specifically the role of the Republican Party in this crisis.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't hold back. He calls them out for either denying climate change outright or just advocating for inaction.
He even goes so far as to ask whether the Republican Party is the most dangerous organization in human history because of their stance on climate change.
That's a bold statement.
It is, but he backs it up by drawing a parallel to James Madison, one of the founding fathers of the U.S.
What does Madison have to do with climate change?
Well, Madison warned about what he called stock jobbers, controlling the government. Basically, he was worried about the influence of private interests. And Chomsky argues that we're seeing that play out today with the fossil fuel industry's grip on policy.
So it's not just about science or even ethics, it's about power dynamics and who controls the levers of government.
Exactly. So where does that leave us? What can we do in the face of such powerful forces?
Well, Chomsky acknowledges the importance of international cooperation, but he's also realistic about its limitations.
He points to things like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and the push for nuclear weapons-free zones.
Sounds promising, right?
On the surface, yeah. But Chomsky argues that these efforts are often undermined by national self-interest. For example, He points to the U.S. blocking a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East
Why would they do that?
because they want to protect Israel's nuclear arsenal. It's a classic case of putting national interests ahead of global security.
It seems like we're constantly teetering on the edge of disaster.
And we've come closer than many people realize. There have been numerous close calls, incidents where we were on the brink of nuclear war.
Like what?
Take Operation Able Archer in the 1980s. The U.S. was running a simulation of a nuclear attack, and the Soviets almost mistook it for the real thing.
Yikes. That's terrifying.
It really is. And there have been other close calls, often averted by the actions of individuals who disobeyed orders or made split-second decisions that could have had catastrophic consequences.
So sometimes it comes down to the courage of a single person to prevent a global catastrophe.
Exactly. Chomsky highlights figures like Stanislav Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov. These are people who basically saved humanity but are barely known to the public.
We owe them a huge debt of gratitude, but it's scary to think that our fate could rest on the shoulders of a few individuals.
And Chomsky connects this to the current situation with Russia, where tensions are high, partly because of the expansion of NATO.
NATO, isn't that supposed to be a defensive alliance?
That's the idea. But it's become a major point of contention with Russia. After the Cold War ended, there was a chance to create a new security architecture in Europe that included Russia.
So, what happened?
Well, despite assurances given to Gorbachev, the U.S. pushed for NATO expansion. Newly declassified documents reveal that they basically misled Gorbachev about their intentions.
So instead of a more cooperative, peaceful Europe, we ended up with the current situation, where NATO is right on Russia's doorstep.
It's a recipe for mistrust and potential conflict. And with the backdrop of nuclear weapons and climate change, it's a very dangerous situation.
So what does Chomsky say we can do about all of this? Is there any hope?
He's actually quite adamant about the need for popular mobilization, for people to get involved and demand change.
He's a big believer in the power of activism.
Absolutely. He argues that systems of power rarely change unless they're forced to by public pressure.
So it's not about relying on our leaders to do the right thing. It's about us, the people, making our voices heard.
He points to the success of movements, like the environmental movement and the anti-nuclear movement, as proof that collective action can work.
So he's not just doom and gloom. There's a sense of possibility there, too.
Definitely. He believes in the power of people to create change.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be easy. We're up against some very powerful forces.
And we've got a long way to go.
We do. But Chomsky's message is ultimately one of empowerment. We have agency, we have a voice, and we have a responsibility to use them.
It's a call to action.
It is. Now, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and explore some of the challenges and opportunities that come with trying to create change in the face of these existential threats.
Before the break, we were talking about this gap, this disconnect, between the folks who are hyper-aware of these huge existential threats and then those just trying to make it through the day.
Right. It's like they're living in different realities. And Chomsky really digs into this. He talks about the resentment towards those educated elites, who might seem out of touch with the everyday struggles of working people.
It's like they're speaking different languages.
Totally. And Chomsky even points out that the U.S., for all its wealth and power, has this history of what he calls cultural backwardness.
Cultural backwardness, that's a pretty strong term.
Yeah, it is. But he's talking about how, for a lot of people, religion is this source of comfort and community. And the idea of climate change, it just clashes with their deeply held beliefs.
It's like a fundamental worldview conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we bridge that gap? Chomsky points to the work of sociologist Arlie Hochschild. Have you heard of her?
Vaguely, you remind me.
So she spent years living in these impoverished communities in Louisiana, deep in Trump country, to try to understand their perspective.
Wow, that's really getting into the trenches.
Right. And what she found is fascinating. These are folks who feel left behind, ignored by the elites. Their jobs are disappearing. Their communities are falling apart.
And they're angry. They're looking for someone who understands their anger.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that someone is often a demagogue who exploits those fears and anxieties for their own gain. But Chomsky makes this interesting point. He says that even seemingly opposed groups, like Trump's supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters, could have formed a united bloc.
Really? What would bring those two groups together?
Shared economic interests, They're both struggling. They both feel like the system is rigged against them.
That's fascinating. It suggests that our political categories might be masking deeper, more fundamental concerns.
Right. And if we can tap into those shared anxieties, those shared aspirations, maybe we can start building bridges instead of walls.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity. We're all facing these existential threats, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. It's not about left versus right. It's about survival. And this brings us to Chomsky's later addition to his thesis, the idea that the undermining of democracy itself is a third existential threat.
A third one. Wow, that's a lot to grapple with.
It is. But he's essentially saying that as our democratic institutions erode, as authoritarianism rises, and as disinformation spreads, it becomes even harder to tackle the threats of nuclear war and climate change.
Because you need a functioning democracy to respond effectively to these kinds of crises.
Exactly. It's like we're fighting on multiple fronts, and the weakening of democracy makes it harder to win on any of them.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connections here.
And Chomsky draws some pretty stark parallels to the rise of fascism in the 1930s, just before World War II. He even talks about his own experience as a kid, witnessing the advance of fascism in Europe.
That must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about the fall of Barcelona, the flood of refugees, this overwhelming sense of doom, and you can tell it really left a mark on him.
It's a reminder of how quickly things can unravel, how fragile democracy can be.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that we're seeing a similar trend today with the rise of what he calls the ultranationalist, reactionary international.
The ultranationalist, reactionary international.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. But he's talking about figures like Bolsonaro in Brazil, these far-right parties gaining traction in Europe, and of course Trump and his allies here in the U.S.
He's saying they're all connected.
He sees them as part of a coordinated movement, emboldened by each other's successes, pushing an agenda that undermines democratic norms.
It's like a global wave of authoritarianism.
And he's particularly critical of the Trump administration's foreign policy, especially figures like Pompeo and Bolton. He calls them out for their hawkish stance, their disregard for international cooperation.
And he also points to the expulsion of Julian Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy as a blatant attack on freedom of the press.
Right. He sees that as a symptom of this broader trend towards authoritarianism. And it's not just happening in other countries, it's happening here in the U.S. too.
So you've got this erosion of democratic norms, the spread of disinformation, the increasing polarization of our political system. It's a lot.
It is. And it makes it so much harder to address these other existential threats like nuclear war and climate change.
Because you need a functioning democracy to tackle those kinds of problems effectively.
Exactly. And Chomsky reminds us that the threat of nuclear war is still very real. He talks about the Trump administration's nuclear posture review, which actually expanded the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. military strategy.
Oh, really? They expanded the role of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it was a pretty controversial move. And Chomsky is also concerned about the U.S. undermining arms control treaties, things like the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty.
Those were big deals, right? Treaties that helped reduce the risk of nuclear war during the Cold War.
Exactly. And now we're seeing a return to this kind of Cold War thinking, which is really dangerous.
And then you have climate change, which is already having a devastating impact around the world.
Rising temperatures, melting ice sheets, more extreme weather events. The evidence is overwhelming.
But yet you still have these major corporations and banks pouring money into fossil fuel projects.
Right. Short-term profit over long-term sustainability. It's a classic case of greed trumping common sense.
So is Chomsky saying there's no hope?
He's not exactly optimistic about the system's ability to self-correct. He thinks real change is going to have to come from pressure, from social movements, from activists who are demanding a different path.
People power.
Exactly. He points to the Sunrise Movement and their work on the Green New Deal as an inspiring example of how a small group of dedicated activists can have a real impact.
It shows that it's possible to push these big, powerful institutions in a different direction.
But it's a tough fight. And Chomsky's realistic about the challenges. He knows that a lot of people are just trying to get by. They're preoccupied with their own economic struggles. It's hard to think about saving the planet when you're worried about putting food on the table.
That's a fair point.
And he also acknowledges those deep cultural divides in the U.S., the distrust of elites, the influence of religion on people's worldviews.
It's a complex landscape. So the question is, how do we overcome these hurdles? How do we build a movement that's powerful enough to address these existential threats?
Chomsky suggests it starts with education. with raising awareness, with helping people connect the dots between these seemingly disparate issues.
It's about showing people how these issues affect their lives, their communities, their future.
Exactly. And it's about approaching these conversations with empathy, with a willingness to listen to those who feel unheard, to bridge those divides that are tearing us apart.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity.
Because ultimately, we're all in this together, facing a shared future on this planet.
And time is running out. We don't have the luxury of waiting for someone else to fix it.
We need to act, and we need to act now.
And Chomsky himself is a pretty good example of that, right? He's been fighting for social justice, for peace, for environmental sustainability for decades. He never gives up.
He's a true inspiration, and he reminds us that even in the face of these overwhelming challenges, we can't afford to lose hope.
Hope is what fuels action.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the world of Noam Chomsky, I think the key takeaway is this. We're not powerless.
We have a choice to make.
We do. We can choose to be passive, to give in to despair, or we can choose to fight for a better future.
Internationalism or extinction, those are the stakes.
And as Chomsky puts it, the choice is ultimately ours.
Let's choose wisely.
Absolutely. Now, in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to shift gears a bit and really dig into Chomsky's ideas about effective activism. What strategies work, what pitfalls to avoid, and how to stay motivated when the going gets tough.
Sounds good. I'm ready for some concrete advice.
We'll also explore his thoughts on education, organization, and solidarity.
The building blocks of a powerful movement.
Exactly. So stay tuned for part 3 of our exploration into the thought-provoking world of Noam Chomsky. It's a conversation that's essential for anyone who cares about the future of humanity.
Okay, so we've talked about the threats, the sort of interconnected web of nuclear war, climate change, and the erosion of democracy itself.
Yeah, pretty bleak stuff.
It is, but Chomsky, he doesn't leave us hanging. He actually offers a message of, well, I guess you could say empowerment. Empowerment. How so?
He really believes that we have the power to change things, not just as individuals, but as a global community. We have the power to shape a different future.
I like the sound of that. But where do we even begin?
Well, Chomsky, he's a huge advocate for grassroots movements. He's seen firsthand how powerful activism can be, even when it seems like you're up against impossible odds.
He's got a point. People power can be pretty amazing.
Right. He often talks about historical examples like the anti-nuclear movement back in the 80s, or more recently, the Sunrise Movement and their work pushing the Green New Deal. These weren't some top-down initiatives, They were ground-up movements fueled by people who just, well, they demanded a better future.
Passionate people coming together to make a difference. I love that.
And Chomsky emphasizes that activism can take so many forms. It's not just about marching in the streets, although that definitely has its place.
Yeah, there are tons of ways to get involved.
Right. It's about educating yourself, talking to others, raising awareness, organizing in your community, building coalitions, putting pressure on those in power. There are so many ways to make your voice heard.
He uses this analogy of a group of mothers who want a traffic light installed at a dangerous intersection.
A traffic light.
Yeah. They might start by talking to each other, then organizing, making flyers, contacting their local representatives.
It seems like such a small thing, a traffic light.
It is, but it's an example of how ordinary people can exercise their collective power to actually make a tangible difference in their community.
And I bet those small victories, they could have a ripple effect, inspire other people to get involved too.
Absolutely. It creates a sense of possibility, like, hey, we can actually change things if we work together.
But Chomsky also stresses the need for, I guess you could say, strategic thinking, thinking bigger picture.
So it's not just about doing something, it's about doing it effectively.
Right. He cautions against activism that's purely symbolic or just driven by personal conviction without really thinking about the consequences.
So, what's the point you're trying to make? What kind of impact are you hoping to have? Those are important questions to consider.
Definitely. And he even talks about civil disobedience, He says it's most effective when it's part of a carefully planned strategy.
A strategy that aims to win over public opinion, not just make a statement.
Exactly. He gives this interesting example from his time at MIT. There were all these protests against military research on campus.
I can see why that would be controversial.
Oh, yeah. Huge debate. Some activists wanted to ban the research outright. But Chomsky, he argued that keeping it on campus where it could be scrutinized, debated openly, that was actually a more strategic approach.
Interesting. So sometimes the best way to challenge something isn't to shut it down completely, but to expose it.
Right. Force transparency. Make those in power accountable for their actions.
Makes sense. But what about engaging with people who just, they see the world completely differently, especially on these really charged issues like climate change or social justice?
That's a tough one. But Chomsky, he emphasizes the importance of empathy. He often talks about the work of the sociologist Arlie Hochschild, remember?
Oh, yeah, the one who lived in those Trump-supporting communities in Louisiana.
Right. Her research showed that a lot of these folks, they felt completely left behind by everything. The economy, the social changes. They felt ignored, disrespected by the elites.
So their support for Trump, it was kind of a backlash, a way of saying, hey, we're here too, listen to us.
Exactly. And Chomsky's point is that we need to approach these conversations with a willingness to understand, not to judge, not to lecture, but to really listen.
Finding that common ground, that shared humanity. Easier said than done, though.
Oh, for sure. It's a challenge, but it's crucial.
Because at the end of the day, we're all on this planet together.
Yeah.
We need to find a way to work together.
And Chomsky really drives home the urgency of it all. We don't have time to waste. We can't afford to wait for someone else to fix this mess.
It's on us.
It is.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play.
Yeah.
And Chomsky, he walks the walk. He's been fighting for justice, for peace, for a sustainable future for decades.
He's a true inspiration, never gives up.
And that's really what it comes down to,
Yeah.
right? That spirit of perseverance, that refusal to lose hope.
Hope is contagious. It's what fuels action.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Noam Chomsky, I think the key takeaway is this. We are not powerless. We have the power to choose a different path, to imagine a better future, and to fight for it.
It all starts with us, with each of us taking responsibility, finding our own way to contribute, and never giving up hope.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of Noam Chomsky. We hope you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking. If you'd like to learn more, we've included some resources in the show notes.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Until next time.